Hello everyone and welcome to the February First Thursday Club. A warm welcome to everyone. Before we start, I'd like to make an apology, which is that my laptop screen is broken, so I'm using my second screen. So in order to see what's going on, I need to look here. So apologies for not looking directly at you. Today we're going to hear from Robin Jones, and he's going to be talking about life on the road, the biodiversity of highways. Before I hand over to Robin though, there's a few housekeeping notes, and those of you that are regular joiners will have seen this before, but for those of you new, we mute microphones throughout the presentation for obvious reasons. But we'd really encourage questions from people, and we can use the questions function on the dialog box for the GoToWebinar. Just pile the questions in while Robin's talking. I'll be sifting through those, and at the end of Robin's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session based around those questions. After the presentation today, we'll be emailing out a short questionnaire to all the attendees for your feedback, which is really welcomed and helps us adapt things as we go along. Before I hand over to Robin, I'll just give him a bit of an introduction. Robin's an associate director with Biocensus, and he's been here, he tells me, for 4.5 years, which seems it's only been 5 minutes for me, but there you go. This year he's actually celebrating his 20th year in ecological consultancy, having previously worked elsewhere. By no particular design, his professional experience has been predominantly in infrastructure projects, working on highway construction, highways improvements, including telecommunications and smart motorways, and in the rail sector with numerous rail upgrade projects and high output track renewals. Most recently, like many of us, much of Robin's time has been spent working on one particular very large new build railway somewhere between London and Birmingham. His particular area of expertise is in terrestrial protected species survey, mitigation and licensing, and he works particularly with great crested newts, reptiles, water voles and badgers. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Robin.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, welcome to the presentation. Okay, hopefully you can see the presentation running now. So what I'm going to cover to begin with, well, over the course of this will be a discussion of the key impacts associated with highway schemes, a very quick summary of what we believe are the common pitfalls in assessment and mitigation of these impacts, and some thoughts for the future, thinking about some of the solutions to these. So highway schemes and linear infrastructure projects in general, including rail, busways, pipelines and so on, require a particular approach that may not always be the same as projects which occupy a single plot of land or affect an extensive area. Construction projects will be in common with development in almost any sector, with habitat loss and mortality of individual species. So we're referring to a general reduction in biodiversity over a given area. This impact is easy to understand for those people tasked with delivering a project, the decision makers and regulators, and the public. What sets apart highways projects are often the narrow areas of land in which the project has to be delivered. The requirement to compulsory purchase land and the responsible management of project cost mean that projects are delivered in the minimum area of land possible. This means there are no field corners or open space which may be given a secondary purpose for habitat creation or species translocation. There is the permanent hard surface and just enough land around it to accommodate signage, technology, road safety and screening. Minimizing project costs is to be welcomed, of course, but ultimately we need to find ways to incorporate new requirements of biodiversity net gain into our projects. And this is backed by an increasing public awareness of the global issue of biodiversity loss. Operationally, the ecological impacts of linear infrastructure projects are very varied. A well-designed and constructed pipeline or cable route, for example, will have very little ongoing adverse effect, whereas railways and major roads in particular bring new issues. Highway schemes and linear infrastructure projects. I'm sorry, my slides are not catching up. So the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges uses the key source of environmental assessment guidance for roads development across Great Britain and Northern Ireland, identifies 6 key impacts which may result from road schemes. We can see that the first is common to any construction project, but the other 5 are impacts which will occur during the design life of the road and potentially longer. Note that decommissioning impacts are almost never considered. Once a road is in situ, there is no expectation for decommissioning, as might be the case for other types of development such as wind turbines or power stations. I think these 6 can be simplified into 3 broad categories, with fragmentation and loss of connectivity being very closely linked, and the final 3 being grouped together under the heading of degradation or environmental change. There is also an impact on animal species peculiar to transport schemes, including railways and busways, but most prevalent on A roads, which is worth highlighting: the mortality of individual animals. So in Great Britain, there are 247,500 miles of road. And just thinking for a moment, that's greater than the distance from here to the moon. So the scale of operational impacts of roads is vast. Also, there's been an incredible increase in roads, 5,000 miles since the year 2000. And whilst that's a very small percentage, it is a very significant number. Last year, insurance firm Go Compare published a summary report on wildlife road deaths, which included this handy graphic presenting the number of animal road deaths recorded in a year. The report was based on data collected by Project Splatter, a team of researchers at Cardiff University who are using citizen science to collect data on roadkill around the UK. Badgers topped the list at over 2,000 casualties in the year, but perhaps a larger number of smaller animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, went unrecorded, which means the impact of roads on their populations cannot be quantified. So what is the impact of road mortality on species? I suppose the harsh reality is that where populations are high and the species are not threatened, the death of individual animals on roads will not have a significant impact on the favourable conservation status of the species. And therefore, within ecological impact assessment, road mortality for these species will end up as an acceptable consequence of the project, adverse but not significant. However, for species of principal importance for biodiversity, those which are rare and or have suffered significant decline, the situation is surely different. Road mortality needs to be considered within impact assessment and measures to overcome it included within scheme design. The difficulty is in determining when road mortality will matter enough to tip the balance from favourable to unfavourable status, and how to tease out the effect of road mortality from other impacts to the population. We may be overlooking a more significant effect which is acting in parallel, such as habitat loss or degradation. One comprehensive study on the effects on bats noted that species may adapt quickly to habitat loss or reduced habitat quality, but collision mortality, unless it's very high, may not have a detectable effect for several bat generations. This has the effect that true adverse effects of a scheme may not be identified for projects, even where there is good post-construction monitoring. And anyway, by that time, it'll be too late. Just before we leave road mortality, a quick note to consider the impact of animal vehicle collisions on road safety. It's an important consideration in highway design, particularly in areas with populations of large mammals. In this country, that's primarily deer, but there are plenty of cases where driver avoidance of smaller animals in the road has led to human injury and fatalities. The Deer Initiative reviewed data over a 5-year period and found records of 20 human fatalities and 785 personal injury accidents resulting from deer on roads. So in this next slide, we'll skim through some of the factors of highway schemes which result in reduction of biodiversity through environmental changes. The effects may be felt off-site as a result of the operation of the road, but there may also be effects on-site, such as lighting. Knowledge of the impact of road traffic on habitats via air quality is nothing new. Pollutants come from a range of sources, but vehicle emissions are known to be the single largest source of nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen dioxide is considered to be the key driver of change in roadside plant communities. And many habitats of nature conservation importance are adapted to low nutrient conditions and or are vulnerable to acidification and sensitive to additional airborne nitrogen. Evidence suggests that vegetation is impacted up to 200 meters from roads, although it could still be discernible at greater distances. The effects of pollutant loading to the environment are cumulative, so major roads which have been in place for many years will have had the greatest effect on the habitats which surround them. But in the future, perhaps we can expect the switch from combustion engines to electric vehicles to result in fewer new impacts, though those old impacts will still be present in the environment for some time to come. Noise, vibration, and visual disturbance may also be factors likely to result in adverse effects, though the effects are not easy to quantify, and there is much evidence to suggest that species adapt to their new conditions. When studying reptiles on roads, we regularly found snakes of all 3 native species within 2 meters of the tarmac, and there is barely a road verge or rail embankment in the country which doesn't have a badger set in it. So species can become adapted to the conditions, and in some cases flourish in roadside habitats. Various studies have shown change in abundance of species in the vicinity of roads, though the precise driver for this is not always easy to pin down to a single impact. In a study of bird populations presented in Nature Communications a couple of years ago, more than half of the bird species recorded showed a reduced abundance with increased exposure to roads, and the effect was more pronounced for rare, small-bodied and migrant species. The results stated that reductions in abundance may be attributed to direct mortality from collisions or avoidance of areas around roads due to noise or visual disturbance, which decreased the perceived habitat quality. They also found the abundance of some more common species showed a positive correlation with roads, presumably benefiting from something the road corridor provides. This dichotomy, some species becoming more abundant, others becoming less abundant, has the effect of pushing out the rarer, less adaptable species. This is evolution, perhaps, but the reason for any extinction would be the proliferation of roads. So lastly here is lighting. When light spill from a road is poorly controlled, it can result in adverse effects in the surrounding areas. For example, displacing dark-loving nocturnal species and affecting resting patterns of diurnal ones. Much work has been done to investigate the response of bats and the flying invertebrates on which they feed to road lighting. And there is some evidence of a so-called vacuum effect, where insects may be attracted from dark areas to well-lit areas, resulting in an abundance of prey for those bats which are most light sensitive, such as myotis or horseshoe bats. Of course, the less light sensitive species such as pipistrelle and noctule might take advantage of swarming insects around streetlights, but then they may be more prone to collision with traffic as a result. So to understand the third of our main impacts of highway schemes is fragmentation. We'll have a quick ecology lesson. So large populations are less likely to go extinct than small populations because their individuals come with a wider range of characteristics, some better able to cope with environmental changes such as food availability or extreme weather, or are better at reproducing than the others. So if we consider that this is a distribution map showing our species spread across the country, and we want to build a road across it, we can see that the individuals under the road will be removed, but overall that's a small impact that's outweighed by the large size and scale of the distribution of that species. So it's no problem. However, if we look a little closer at the populations of our animal, which are living in patches of the most suitable habitats, we see that each population is reliant on each other. Individuals from one move to another, maintaining the overall one healthy population. So here's our road, and we've used avoidance to only affect one of the subpopulations, avoiding the other 6. So it's a win for the ecologists. But look, our population is now becoming fragmented. The previously commutable distances now have barriers, and the population, the one population which was lost was a kingpin for all of the rest. What happens now is that the populations are less resilient. Individually, they're not able to accommodate the natural environmental event, such as a flood. And of course, we're hearing all the time that extreme weather events will become increasingly frequent due to changing climate. So where does that leave us? If we look back at the broad scale, we'll see that everything is fine. But now we know that the separate small populations are extremely vulnerable to extinction, and the highway development was the catalyst in the decline. So what are the common pitfalls? I think we're not always good at thinking on the landscape scale about how animals use the landscape and about fragmentation effects. We're not always good about thinking about long-term implications, thinking of the cumulative years of nitrogen deposition on roadside habitats. Do we place enough emphasis on the avoidance of impacts? And that's not to say we don't achieve any success in avoiding impacts, but additional cost is often the reason the nice to haves don't make it into reality. Making the best of habitat management. Look how disused railways and so on, linear habitats have the opportunity to be great linear nature reserves, but they're often nutrient loaded or overmanaged. And we're not very good at ensuring that our mitigation measures have a sound basis in evidence. Do our measures work? How do we ensure they're in the right place? And take that little opportunity to plug a talk on the first Thursday in July, where Des is going to be talking about evidence base in mitigation. One area where evidence is key when considering the effects of road mortality on rare species, where the loss of even small numbers of individuals can have a significant effect on the species' favourable conservation status. Collision risk modelling has merit where simple measures such as fencing would not prove effective. For example, species which fly at vehicle height, such as bats, or agile ones which cannot be contained by fencing, such as pine marten. It's also useful where mitigation measures would be difficult to integrate with, for example, road safety features, or to justify the high costs of installation and maintenance of mitigation features. Looking beyond our own horizons, collision modelling has been undertaken on kangaroos on Australian roads and deer on highways in the USA, perhaps a reflection on the higher human costs of animal vehicle collisions with large mammals in those countries. However, studies which may be more directly applicable to the UK do exist. In 2014, a Portuguese study modelled the impact of road mortality on barn owls, including the probability of extinction. It found that an annual road mortality rate of 5% reduced barn owl populations to half their original size. And simulations showed that the probability of extinction would increase dramatically when road mortality exceeded 30%. This wasn't related to the original population size, and so that's a lesson that even large populations can be put at risk by road mortality. In the UK, we believe the use of collision models for transport schemes is fairly limited at present, but there are a few examples. As part of the impact assessment for East West Rail 2 in Buckinghamshire in 2019, back crossing point survey data was used to calculate the probability of back collisions with trains, for example. And a recent academic study undertook modelling to predict high and low probability areas for hedgehog, looking at a national level. More detail would be needed to model those at a scheme level. So assessing and mitigating fragmentation. It's about looking at the wider landscape and understanding the species within it, rather than simply starting with your scheme. At the PEA stage of a project, think about sensitive sites and habitats which might be some distance from the scheme, and the distance at which the effects your scheme might be felt. This will be different for all species, habitats, but it's your zone of influence, and this is where you carry out your baseline surveys. We need to think about how we will get our species across the road as often as possible to minimize the effects of fragmentation. There is advice out there. For example, EU-funded COST 341 project resulted in this handbook, European Handbook for Identifying Conflicts and Designing Solutions, so a critical resource for ecologists and highway designers alike. Viaducts, such as the one shown, provide some of the best opportunities for avoiding barrier effects, especially for aquatic species, maintaining the natural character of rivers and riverbanks as they pass beneath the bridge. And the best examples of green bridges or tunnels can be similarly effective because they provide a continuous habitat link. Woodland and hedgerows, as well as other habitat features, can be created on a green bridge to recreate and connect seamlessly into existing habitats on one side and to the other. However, where schemes are small or constrained within the landscape, smaller multi-species culverts are a useful solution. Excuse me. Minimizing the distance from one side to the other and maximizing the height of the structure and width of the structure is the key to success for multi-species culverts. Crossing points of any kind, though, are rarely effective unless combined with a barrier, typically a fence or tree planting, to prevent animals from flitting across the road and instead guide them to the crossing point. Locating crossing points on existing paths, for example for badgers, or flight lines for bats, which needs to be based on detailed survey data, will have the greatest success. Ideally, our survey should allow us to build a picture of how each species at risk of fragmentation uses the landscape. Where are the hibernation sites? Where are the breeding sites or the foraging areas? And then decide if the scheme would form a barrier to any of these critical areas. Difficulties arise where a scheme cuts through one continuous habitat, though. For example, if a scheme is bounded on either side by continuous woodland. In these examples, identifying individual pathways or flight lines might be impossible, and for species where fencing is not effective, it may be impossible to prevent animals from crossing. In this situation, I would seek that we provide frequent crossing points. Resisting the urge to reduce cost at the expense of biodiversity, installing additional crossing points will provide the best chance for the species to adapt to the presence of the scheme in the long term and to respond to future environmental change. The careful design of retained and reinstated lands, such as road verges, can provide large biodiversity benefits, especially within an impoverished wider landscape. In some cases, they already provide refuges for species, and along with rail corridors, cycleways, way levers for power lines, and historic features such as disused railways or canals, they act as corridors for wildlife movement. But we do see things could be better. Management measures do not always bring out the best in habitats. Quite often, roadside management would favour common species, those which do best in nutrient-enriched habitats, and this in time will lead to increasingly uniform and impoverished flora. National highways in England do make funding available for management schemes which encourage pollinators within the soft estate, which is certainly a really positive step. And it'd be great to see an increasing number of these schemes. But there is a risk that standard approaches, such as the use of standard seed mixes everywhere, can lead to uniformity, not the diversity that we need. So we consider that the scope for inventive and interesting mitigation can be limited by current funding regimes. Schemes should embrace local conditions and the characteristic habitats and species that can be found there. So, Biodiversity Net Gain. Ever since the Natural Environments and Rural Communities Act in 2006, public bodies such as National Highways, local authorities or Network Rail have had a biodiversity duty, whereby they must have regard to the conservation of biodiversity. In England, this is strengthened by the Environment Act 2021, which now requires them to also enhance biodiversity to make it better and not just conserve the status quo. Many of you will have heard of Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG. The Environment Act introduces the commitment that all consented projects must ensure that there is at least 10% more biodiversity on completion than compared with what there was at the start. This is the government's intention to address the decline of biodiversity so often resulting from development and land use change. Sorry, slide slipped there. Projects will need to calculate the current value of biodiversity on their site, the baseline, using a metric published or approved by the Secretary of State, so the DEFRA metric, and the project's biodiversity value on completion will be the sum of the value of biodiversity completed on the completed project on site, the value of any off-site biodiversity gain made by or on behalf of the project, which must be registered in the publicly accessible biodiversity gain site register, and the value of any biodiversity credits which can be purchased for the project from the Secretary of State. So projects will be able to proceed without incorporating space for habitats on site, which is good news for projects with very limited land available. But nevertheless, they will have a legal requirement to create or fund biodiversity enhancement off-site. The potential cost of off-site gain and biodiversity credits will need to be a consideration in the planning of all schemes going forward, and it will therefore be advisable for project managers to understand the implications of BNG as early as possible. Where it is possible, delivering on-site mitigation enhancement will likely prove to be the most cost-effective. It will reduce the cost which needs to be sent off-site, and so implementing some of the mitigations which were once considered to be too expensive, for example, larger or more frequent crossing points, may now be a more attractive option. Certainly increasing the biodiversity value of road verges through their design or planting specification, and implementing management measures which tackle nutrient enrichment such as removal of grass cuttings, as simple as that, could take into account the life cycles, and management should take into account the life cycles of the species present. Where biodiversity net gain in linear projects can play a key role in the future will be to rely on the thing that makes them unique. The entire point is that they connect places for people, but also for nature. The requirement for net gain might mean that we see projects aiming to incorporate additional land within the red line that can be improved for biodiversity from day one. For linear infrastructure projects, just small pockets of extra land at regular intervals will provide a place for ecological mitigation to be delivered, and it will almost certainly prove invaluable in the long term as stepping stones or refuges for rare or threatened species. One of the drivers behind biodiversity net gain is to restore habitat linkages across the landscape. So in fact, the enhancement of existing road verges, either through redesign or careful management, could be used as a means of offsetting biodiversity impacts of new projects. And with more than 247,000 miles of road, the national and local highway authorities of the UK are not short of space to do this. Indeed, if allied to local nature conservation strategies, which are currently being drawn up by local councils across England to connect up isolated fragments of priority habitat and designated sites, this enhancement could contribute significantly to strategic objectives for connecting biodiversity across the landscape. In addition, the contribution that road schemes could make to connecting biodiversity along their length, there is also the potential for the strategic installation of green bridges to enhance connectivity across roads and thus contribute to regional biodiversity. This would be especially beneficial in areas where large-scale rewilding is being proposed. Thus, rather than green bridges being bolted onto projects in order to achieve consent, it might be better that a more strategic approach is taken. Rather than using an expensive green bridge to provide a localized benefit, it might instead be more ecologically sensible to think at a regional level, for example, to provide a critical link as part of an LNRS, or perhaps regional scale rewilding. So on this basis, highway schemes can definitely contribute to biodiversity net gain and improvements for biodiversity in the long term. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I'll hand it back to Tim for some questions.
Thank you very much, Robin. Yeah, fascinating talk, and we've had quite a lot of questions come in, so we'll start on those straight away. That was the first one. Would you be prepared to say whether or not the Plant Life Road Verge Management Guidance from 2019 is worthy of being used as a standard reference to road verge management with appropriate variations where local conditions demand it, etc.?
Well, As you might have heard in my bio, I'm more of a protected species person, but I would have thought there is probably scope for it to be used. I wouldn't be prepared to say for definite in all cases, but yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, the other one here was how were the findings of collision risk modelling used to change the East-West Rail 2 mitigation design?
Okay, so the modelling ended up showing that that there wouldn't be an issue for the favourable conservation status. The assessment of the numbers of collisions and so on were thought to be sufficiently low, so it didn't add to mitigation. But at the time they did it, it was done early enough in the process that it could have changed design if needed.
Thank you. Should new roads, if they have to be built, include designs for habitats for all species, regardless of what is surveyed locally, in order to support biodiversity net gain?
Requirement is quite strong, but I think that they should be encouraged to include additional space for habitat. I think one way of achieving net gain will be to include additional areas for habitats and species along schemes, and as we said, so providing stepping stones and so on can only be of benefit. So they'll almost be encouraged to by the nature of the net gain legislation of providing 10% gain.
Sure. There's another linked one here to BNG. Is there a risk that on-site biodiversity net gain will end up being too many, too small, or as opposed to not bigger, better, and more joined up? I guess alluding to the idea that I think you touched on it a bit in the end, that strategic approach where you have a large area where people offset off-site as opposed to just trying to do it around the edges and it being a bit too piecemeal.
Yes, I suppose there is a risk of that, but I don't think that's a change from what the current status quo. I think currently, if projects aren't required to offset, they're only doing those little bits around the edges, and by requiring a project to have a 10% gain, if it can't be delivered on site, then you do have that possibility for off-site mitigation and funding with biodiversity credits, a larger project, and maybe it will make people think more about whether the cost of delivering on site is worth it, or whether that cost is better spent elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah. Again, sort of linked to this, and making reference to your experience as a protected species person, you might not be able to answer this, but that's fine. Are road schemes going to be required to demonstrate nitrate neutrality? I guess in the same way that new house build are going to have to.
I honestly, I'm not sure about that. I think it certainly makes sense, and certainly management schemes should address that. Management and pollution prevention schemes should address it, but I don't know if they'll be required to do so. No,
sure. Okay. I have one here that it's fairly long, but it's actually I think it's probably worth reading out. So if you just bear with me. Okay. It's from Andrew Anderson. He said, "Thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm a landscape architect working on a master plan for a major new IUCN protected area, 1,600 square kilometres in Saudi Arabia. Our site is ringed by roads. We are proposing neither wildlife overpasses nor it's actually oven passes, but I don't think that's what you mean, although it is in Saudi, nor wildlife underpasses, but rather keeping the animal," and it's mentioned here key species of ungulates and Arabian wolves and leopards and so on, as the priority, so not subjecting them to going above ground or below ground, but keeping the wildlife corridor at grade and forcing the road into a tunnel below the ground. Do you know of any precedents of this approach?
So
it's pretty extreme, isn't it? Having to tunnel the road to avoid the wildlife, but it's interesting point.
Yeah, I don't know of any other specific examples, but I can see that it's the equivalent of if I understand that correctly, it's a sort of cut and cover tunnel to recreate the habitat over the top. So it's effectively the same as a green bridge, but possibly on a much larger scale, which sounds very beneficial.
Yeah, certainly does. Sort of linked to that, actually, if we're talking about green bridges, possibly we'll end on this one. What are the barriers to building green bridges in the UK? I guess possibly alluded to the fact that we don't see as many here as you do elsewhere in the world.
Well, we don't. I think probably until this point, the barrier has been costs. There haven't been many, just one or two, but those schemes that do exist are often used as examples of great, good practice. So yeah, I think it probably comes down to cost and the way projects are funded, the way, if it's an improvement scheme or a scheme for safety, then really, do we need this green bridge? That's a massive extra cost. So I think that's been the approach, but I think maybe things will change with the requirement to incorporate net gain. One thing I didn't touch on, which might be worth noting, is that although I talk about fragmentation and individual species, net gain doesn't necessarily address individual species. It's thinking at habitats, really. But I think we need to try and focus the thoughts around what are we losing biodiversity on site, what are we losing from a scheme. It's not all about the habitats. It will be about connecting species and populations up. So in that respect, green bridges will become not a requirement, but the increasing use of green bridges might be a result of that.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll leave it there, Robin. Thanks once again for a fascinating presentation. And thanks to everybody for attending today. We've had fantastic numbers, so thank you. I will just say that the next First Thursday Club is going to be on the 3rd of March. It's going to be delivered by Dr. Helen Rees, and the entitled eDNA, An Introduction to Environmental DNA in Ecology and Conservation. So I'm sure that will prove pretty popular as well. Just before we sign off, I'll just remind you that we'll be sending out the questionnaire shortly after this, and if you could take the time to fill it in, that would be fantastic. Apart from that, thank you, Robin, thank you, and we'll see you all again next month. Thanks very much.
Okay, bye for now.